Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the second session. This section is intended to seek views from friends in the region on the external dimension or aspects of the Malaysian defense policy, or more specifically on the defense of Malaysia. Now, Malaysian defense policy planners are concerned with many things when we actually did the white paper on defense. Now, among them is how to defend the nation in a world that is fast globalizing, and in a strategic environment where, as the Chief of the Armed Forces Staff or Chief of the Armed Forces said earlier, the predicament that we have right now. So, however, to their credit, the policy planners have long realized that the national defense is no longer sustainable without cooperation, without support from friends, especially those in the neighbors, particularly when the nature of the threat facing us, the threat to our national interests, can be quite nebulous in this period of political uncertainties, and also can be very ill-defined. So that is a challenge that we have. So the fact that we are talking to friends on our defense policy goes to show that we have nothing sinister when we plan our defense policy. In other words, we have nothing to hide, and we believe in transparency. Now, moreover, in Malaysia's case, we take the view that our neighbors are our best friends, our first lines of defense. And we hope that we will remain friends forever. Now, fostering good relations with neighbors and like-minded friends is a core concern of the white paper on defense. You heard of the three pillars. One of the pillars is actually on external relationship. Nonetheless, we are faced with one perennial problem, or challenge rather. That is how to prevent, in terms of policy making, low-level incident exceed among us and between us, from developing into tensions that require the use of force in settling the problem. That is what we are concerned with. Small things that can become big, and the need to employ force, which we want to prevent or control. So, hence the challenge to us all, in as far as looking at the defense policy regionally and bilaterally, is to nip the problem in bud. And I hope that the panel of speakers that we have today can share with us their expertise on how to retain peace and harmony in the age of political uncertainties, and how they can tell us what we need to do in order to strengthen our defense relationship. Now, the organizers for this workshop has assembled very distinguished scholars and policy practitioners from Australia, from Brunei, from Indonesia, and Vietnam. They are all very skillful people. They are all experts in different fields. And to share with us their respective views on how we can strengthen military ties, both at the bilateral and the regional level. I think one of the things that we are concerned today is how we can work together to mitigate some of the problems that we consider to be common to us. For example, how can we cooperate to handle the threat from, say, the current coronavirus? As you know, the infectious disease has a wide footprint with implications on global health, on global security, on geopolitics, as well as global economy. But that's a challenge for us, how to overcome this kind of common problems. The virus becomes more acute, I think, in my view, when some of the states have taken advantage of the political uncertainties in order to create political coalition. You know what I'm talking about, and I think they are now using what we call it misinformation in order to gain some political coalition. Now, as friends, for example, in the region, how can we work together to combat another problem is such conspiracies, such misinformation, and to defeat the threat emanating, for example, in the digital domain, like breaches in cybersecurity. That is another common problem that I think we should look into because it has got defense implication. What can we do together to mitigate the environmental security issues like global warming? The whole world is looking at it. But I think we too have to look at some aspects of the global warming and their impact on security in this situation. And illegal fishing, which is a big thing in our waters today. All the things, these are common issues that we need to address. Now, I invite actually all the speakers to weigh in on these issues and other issues which they think are important as far as fostering better relationship between us in pursuit of our different policy. This morning we are working on a quite tight schedule. We have less than 2 hours to discuss all the issues, and I do hope that the speakers will not spend more than 15 minutes to address the issues. But if you need time, then we will do it at the expense of our lunch, of course. Yeah. So in the interest of time, I will not read the CVs of all the speakers. They are in the booklet. I think they are well-known speakers, well-informed and knowledgeable. So we should benefit from their contribution today. Now, with that short introduction, let me invite the first speaker. And the first speaker is Dr. Evan Laksmana from Indonesia. He is the senior researcher at Center of Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta. Evan, have the floor. You can speak from there.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, first let me express my sincere gratitude to the Ministry of Defense and to MIDAS for having me here today so that I may share some of my thoughts about the inaugural Defense White Paper of Malaysia. It's always a privilege and honor to be back in KL after years of absence to catch up with old friends and hopefully make new ones. But before I share my views on the new white paper, let me say that it's always a tough act to follow from the previous distinguished speaker, so I'm not going to try to go into too much detail about the white paper itself. And if you let me offer some long-term views of what I think could be the path forward for Indonesia and Malaysia in terms of their defense relationship and how it can affect the wider region. And I realize that some of these thoughts may be speculative and out of the box, but I've always felt that when times of discussing defense white papers, it's a time about thinking out loud about some of these ideas that we don't normally explore. Let me begin by commending and applauding the new defense white paper and the processes that produce it. I think the collaboration between academics, civil servants and the military to produce an important, thorough, and well thought out document, I think is certainly a model that's worth emulating across the region, as some of us are also in the process of developing our own white papers. I think that there are a few key reasons why this particular defense white paper from Malaysia is an excellent strategic policy document. First of all, I think the breadth and the scope of the discussion makes it an important strategic building blocks to boost regional transparency, to develop at the very least a common strategic and operational picture of the challenges in the region, and provide avenues, I believe, to explore further cooperation with key partners across the region. Second, I think the regional assessment part of the white paper of current and future trends, from the challenges of great power politics to the role of emerging technologies like AI, I think are particularly spot on. And I do think that we as a whole in Southeast Asia, I don't think we have a good handle on some of these new issues, but we do at least acknowledge its potential importance. And finally, I think as a tool of strategic communication, I think the Defense White Paper has successfully conveyed to the region that Malaysia not only acknowledges its geostrategic importance, but also the responsibilities that come out of that particular role. With these positive key values in mind, I think, of the white paper, let me posit a possible fourth potential useful role for the white paper, which is to potentially explore stronger collaboration and cooperation with Indonesia in particular. I think the background and introduction of the Defense White Paper makes it clear that Indonesia and Malaysia actually share many common strategic outlook and challenges, from the fluctuations in the maritime domain, the uncertainty of great power politics, and even to non-traditional securities like disasters. In fact, the ideas of total people defense, of a comprehensive defense in the new pillars, I think, mirrors quite closely with Indonesia's own conception of a wider whole of society and whole of government approach to security management. And of course, both countries are also strategically located in the Indian and between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So I think a closer defense cooperation between Indonesia and Malaysia could allow both countries collectively to become much more powerful strategic anchors of the Indo-Pacific. So building on the key points raised on the Defense White Paper, particularly with regards to the concentric deterrence and credible partnerships, how should we think about a closer defense cooperation between Indonesia and Malaysia, especially maybe 5, 10, 20 years down the line? I argue that I think the starting point should be about reducing strategic redundancies in force planning and capabilities as much as possible, and instead find common areas within the bilateral or the regional mechanisms in which we can boost strategic multipliers instead. And I think there are 4 particular useful areas where Indonesia and Malaysia could reduce redundancies in strategic planning and thinking and work together much closer somewhere down the line. First is within the information and knowledge domain. I think, yes, we have good collaboration when it comes to information sharing at a bilateral level and perhaps intelligence sharing as well, but I do think there's room for improvement with regards to, for example, the trilateral cooperation with the Philippines. But more broadly, and perhaps more long term, I think there are ways to explore not just in terms of intelligence sharing, but also how do we create common assessment of the key challenges facing the region on the analytical side of things, as well as perhaps much more long term to think of how we can develop a common regional defense language institute. It's an idea that I think when we think of the transnational challenges, and there are some occasional language barriers, both within the region and outside the region, I think a common regional defense language institute where officers and civilian can work together and come together, I think would prove to be useful down the line. The second area, I think, is education and training. I think the white paper makes it clear about the numerous officer exchanges and training, but I do think there needs to be more staff college exchanges at the officer level as well as at the cadet level. I think when I look at Indonesia's side of things, it's a bit unfortunate that I think the biggest supplier of education and training for Indonesia has always been the US and Australia, and that's a great thing, but I would like to see more regional partners within our staff colleges and vice versa, beyond 1 or 2 person every year. On the training side of things, I think we talk a lot about joint training and joint force, but when we do common exercises, it's usually at the surface level or at some combat unit level. And I do think over the long run, thinking about a joint force in terms of joint exercises between both the Malaysian Armed Forces and the Indonesian Defense Forces, I think is something worth thinking down the line. On the operational side of things, I've mentioned earlier about improving intelligence cooperation on the trilateral cooperation agreement, but also in terms of the activities of coordinated surveillance and patrols. It'll be nice if it's beyond coordinated and at some point it's much more integrated and collaborative. And I think this is where the notion of reducing redundancies in terms of creating regional counterterrorism training centers, for example, rather than having them compete for each other between the one that Malaysia is proposing and the one that Indonesia has. It would be nice if we can actually much more collaborative in nature in that aspect. In terms of the defense planning, I also think that there are common ways in which we think about how to prepare the force development and all that. And if we are concerned about great power politics, about the South China Sea, then I think there are some common areas where we can jointly develop scenario-based planning rather than just focusing on an interest-based planning that's specific to Malaysia or specific to Indonesia. But we can think of scenarios in which both Malaysia and Indonesia would be affected and think of long-term strategies to think about how to deal with them. At the ASEAN level as well, I think there are a series of common challenges, whether it's from humanitarian assistance to search and rescue, in which we talk a lot about pooled resources at the military level across ASEAN, but we don't really have a day-to-day interaction when it comes to training, assessment, and planning. So I think if somewhere down the line you think of the pooled resources within ASEAN to collaborate much more stronger at the regional level, I think at some point we have to consider, at least to start off between Indonesia and Malaysia. I think the two biggest countries where most of our challenges actually overlap a lot. These, I think, four main areas. The wider goal, I believe, are lofty, obviously, and given the occasional acrimonious exchanges between KL and Jakarta, it's certainly not the path of least resistance. But I do think that over the long run, if we can at least debate and think about ways in which we reduce redundancies for regional and common challenges and work much closer between Indonesia and Malaysia, and we can start much more simple, for example, between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, the North Natuna Sea, for example. I think we can achieve two main outcomes down the line. First is the potential to deter a wider regional conflict, whether in the maritime domain or beyond. And of course, for the first time, perhaps, given the uncertainty of great power politics, if Jakarta and KL could become a regional net security provider rather than simply relying on great powers to do so. Again, these are lofty ideals and way far down the line. But again, moments like this is when we talk about the defense white paper, how we think of ideas to implement them. I think it's a time to sort of think about how we can ponder the improbable. Once again, I congratulate Malaysia for its excellent white paper and look forward to more discussions later on. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Ashura Saleh from Brunei. She's a very talented lady, and I had the honor actually to work with her on one project many months ago when she was leading a project on the Sulu Sea. And I recall correctly, the project's name was Stable Seas, with respect to Sulu and Silver Seas. Right? The floor is yours.
Very much, Professor. Very good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I would like to thank MIDAS and Malaysia's Ministry of Defense for having me on this panel. I've decided to take a maritime security perspective when trying to share my views on the country's very first defense white paper. I find it is always an honor to be able to be engaging in these platforms, primarily because I'll be able to exchange thoughts with a fellow audience and also panelists, all of which I feel are experts in their own right. I've been given 10 minutes or so, and I know we're working with a really tight time frame. So what I will try to do is take the perspective of the Defense White Paper to survey Malaysia's maritime security situation. The paper begins with setting forth Malaysia's identity, which then paves the way for a specific approach, a specific defense strategy, and a specific perspective of the country's maritime situation. I feel it is critical to be absolutely cognizant of the threats as they are taking place in the country's maritime domain, and then assess if these threats are also reflected in the Defense White Paper. I will then be roughly exploring the concepts and solutions that were proposed in the paper to address Malaysia's maritime security threats. And so the Defense White Paper begins with an immediate recognition of Malaysia's unique maritime status, which the first panel actually looked at as well. But I feel that there are nuances here within this notion that defines the way Malaysia views itself relative to other countries in the region. And this perspective in turn shapes the prioritization of Malaysia's maritime security interests. Within the first few pages of the paper, it is already stated that Malaysia sees itself as a maritime nation with continental roots that is destined to play a bridging linchpin role between the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. Although a simply stated notion, I feel that we should break this down, and there are critical implications to this. Firstly, Malaysia positions itself first and foremost as a Southeast Asian country, building on its close proximity with its neighbors. And so this leads to recognition of shared challenges that they may encounter at sea, but also the massive potential there is to cooperate closely to tackle these threats. Secondly, Malaysia sees itself as a maritime state first, and only then with connections to mainland Southeast Asia and eventually to other regions and countries that can be reached via land-based routes. The paper points to Malaysia's strategic location along the crossroads of key trade flows such as the Straits of Malacca. Other strategic waterways that also overlaps with Malaysia's territory are the South China Sea, Sulu Sea, and Sulawesi Sea. And so this demonstrates that Malaysia is keen in the next 10 years or so to adopt more of a maritime presence into these critical waterways. Thirdly, this vision shows that Malaysia will seek the opportunity as a country connecting two geographical maritime regions to one another, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And in the paper, the strategic location was described as both a blessing and a challenge. It wasn't really developed then on, but it does indicate Malaysia's willingness to play a key role in facilitating increased engagement and coordination between member states of both regions. And lastly, this notion shows that Malaysia seeks to embrace a bridging linchpin role, which embodies an entire set of purposes to bridge, to build, and to bind, and also determines a specific type of defense strategy. This role seeks to enhance both Malaysia's internal resilience and external partnerships, which require restructuring the Malaysian armed forces into an agile, integrated, and focused force. And this in turn then drives a three-tiered vision of what we've been speaking about, having a concentric deterrence, and then a comprehensive deterrence, and then eventually credible partnerships. But how then would this vision direct Malaysia's management of its maritime security interests? And indeed, the paper does look at both traditional and non-traditional maritime security challenges faced by Malaysia. But in terms of traditional interests, the paper defines this as conflicting interests, which arise as an outcome of territorial disputes that are seen to be catalyzed by major power competition. The paper acknowledges that there are outstanding territorial claims that can complicate the resolution of disagreements that stem from the overlapping use of maritime territory and undersea resources, such as the exploration of hydrocarbon. And there are direct and indirect implications of major power competition on Malaysia's maritime security interests. The paper mentioned incursions by foreign government vessels into Malaysian territory as one example of a direct implication. But in terms of indirect implication, I feel more could have been done in exploring that further. Regional polarization, for example, was suggested as one of the outcomes. Nevertheless, the paper recognizes that there are maneuvers at sea, such as militarization and freedom of navigation operations, that may produce signals that can be easily misinterpreted and inevitably risk spiraling into unintended encounters at sea. But I particularly like the fact that the Defense White Paper also recognized that Malaysia's maritime security is afflicted by increasing non-traditional threats. And indeed, there has been a persistent trend of threats such as kidnapping for ransom in the Sulu and Sulawesi seas. I think the most notable incident took place only last month, when 5 Indonesian fishermen were kidnapped off the coast of Lahad Datu in Sabah. The paper also mentions illegal fishing, which is technically defined as the entry of foreign fishing vessels into fishing grounds that are under the jurisdiction of another state. And this is true. Across 2019, across the entire Asia-Pacific region, there had been 566 illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing incidents. And this is a 71% increase from the number of incidents recorded in 2018. But yet I feel that there are other types of threats that could be included under this category. Unreported and unregulated fishing practices were not really mentioned, but I feel that they prove to be as detrimental as illegal fishing. The unregulated use of fishing practices such as cyanide bombing or fish blasting can eradicate the sustainability of Malaysia's fishing resources. Unreported catch can produce unrealistic estimates of Malaysia's fish stocks, which then undermine efforts to preserve the marine environment. And then there is talk of rising maritime drug trafficking, in which under-monitored routes such as the Andaman Sea are being used to traffic methamphetamine from Myanmar into transit points in Malaysia and eventually to the rest of the region. And so, what can be done to tackle these maritime security challenges? The role of geographical proximity play a very large role in the Defence White Paper, and also in shaping Malaysia's approach towards its maritime environment. And as a Southeast Asian state itself, the close proximity that Malaysia has with its regional neighbours have been touted as both a source of challenges and opportunities in the paper. And yes, indeed, this geographical closeness does escalate the risk of transnational security challenges. In the example we looked at earlier about the kidnapping incident in Lahad Datu, we saw that upon the kidnapping of these Indonesian fishermen within Malaysian territory, they were then brought into Philippine territory where they were held hostage. And so we can see that kidnapping for ransom does threaten the maritime security interests of not only Malaysia, but also its neighboring countries. However, with the emphasis on proximity, geographical circumstances should not be the only incentive for cooperation. And this was alluded to earlier by Evan, I feel. There are other factors as well that go beyond sharing borders that should be included in the paper as drivers for cooperation. This includes the desire to protect shared interests, to uphold shared liberal values, and support consistent economic development across the region. Departing from a threat-framed perspective and to build on common interests and opportunities instead can expand the effectiveness and willingness to adopt more cooperative frameworks. And this also provides the mindset that we need for more interest-based initiatives and ties in very well with Malaysia's willingness to want to adopt a wider whole-of-government and whole-of-society approach. Nevertheless, the proximity that ties Malaysia to the rest of the region has led to the formation of more minilateral frameworks between these countries. We've got the Malacca Straits Patrol and the Trilateral Cooperative Arrangement, and these frameworks should indeed set an example for similar initiatives that center on a few member states, which all share a similar threat perception and all within a shared maritime area. And to complement Malaysia's credible partnerships, I admire the Defence White Paper's conscious decision to adopt these two approaches, a whole of government and whole of society, which does indeed strengthen internal resilience. This approach reflects the government's understanding of the connection between Malaysia's maritime status and its continental roots. And this is primarily because maritime security is almost always an extension of developments that take place on land. However, the paper also included a slight mention of the whole-of-nation approach, which I feel could be a lot more developed as well. The whole-society approach will definitely ensure that the rakyat, or citizens of Malaysia, are co-opted into the nationwide effort to protect Malaysia's maritime security interests. Indeed, it is true, maritime threats such as piracy and armed robbery and even illegal fishing are all an outcome of land-based problems, such as relative economic deprivation, weak implementation of regulations, and even the unequal distribution of welfare resources. It is important to enhance interagency coordination with all sectors of society. This includes fishing communities, the shipping industry, local government units, and even NGOs, All these sectors should work closely with one another in order to tackle these land-based problems and limit the spillovers into the maritime domain. And so by combining resources and manpower, these unilateral regional frameworks to try and embody these whole-of-society approaches that was espoused in the Defense White Paper. This will encourage coordination between maritime law enforcement agencies and also with other responsible stakeholders within and across these countries. In doing so, capacity building and training initiatives will be able to synergize strengths, fill gaps, and address resource shortages that other countries may all suffer from. We cannot forget the role of external partners as well, such as the United States and Japan, and even wider regional ASEAN-based initiatives that are also critical in supporting these frameworks by offering direct offers of assistance. Through this wide-ranging approach, regional countries will offer Malaysia the platform that Malaysia needs to tackle a range of maritime security threats that go beyond patrolling waters. And so some suggestions I've been thinking about is maybe this can include working with Malaysia in participating in an enforcement arm of a regional fisheries management organization, also known as an RFNO, to try curb IUU fishing. We could work in better synchronizing maritime enforcement command centers to facilitate the real-time delivery of information, and we could all work together to support land-based economic initiatives that seek to offer legitimate forms of income, which can then deter the coastal communities away from these illicit activities. Through cultivating trust and information sharing efforts, multilateral frameworks such as these can produce a complete picture of our maritime security situation. It can help enhance maritime domain awareness and can help ensure a smooth and immediate coordinated response to unexpected maritime threats. My reading of Malaysia's Defense White Paper further reinforced the notion that achieving maritime security is a task not just designed for the military forces, but is also the responsibility of all sectors of society. This Defense White Paper reflects this understanding by offering logical concepts that can be used to synchronize various efforts that can then protect the country's maritime security interests. I feel that the Defense White Paper is indeed a great step forward by being able to inculcate these concepts. However, the real test of its success lies in the availability of resources and the willingness of all sectors of the nation to work together to implement its strategies and also uphold its principles. I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I do look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Private citizen now, okay. The floor is yours.
Dato' Hamza, Deputy Minister Chin Tom, senior colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure for me to be here in KL today for a number of reasons. I'm very pleased. It's very easy for an Australian former official to be in Malaysia. This is a partnership that goes back to long before I was born, and I've been around for a long time. So it's always an easy place to come to KL. For someone who lives in Canberra, being in KL is welcome refuge from bushfires and floods that seem to afflict much of our country recently. So for me, I'm pleased to be here to celebrate your success. It's no small achievement for a country to deliver a defence white paper. So, Deputy Minister and the team that are here, you, as the years go by, will be prone, as I have been. I was on the Australian Defence White Paper team for 2 years and 2 months, 14 to 16. It took us a lot longer than Malaysia to conclude that document, which reflects one of the national sports in Australia, which is to change prime ministers and ministers with great regularity. So it's in my view, probably the task of preparing and delivering a defence white paper is arguably amongst the most complex of public policy challenges. And for Malaysia, I add my words of praise and commendation to Malaysia for pulling off what in my view is probably the best inaugural defence white paper that I am aware of, and that is a very significant achievement because in a public document everyone is watching. Friends, neighbours, potential adversaries are watching what you say and how you describe your priorities. The challenge is to be candid without being anemic, and that is a very, very fine line to balance, and I think you have achieved that. This is a significant milestone for Malaysia. The Deputy Minister, as the years go by, you will have the occasional nightmare, the occasional pleasant dream about this first effort, but you have set in place a framework that you can now build on in the future. I'll offer some brief observations from an Australian perspective on some of your findings, and then I thought I might give half a dozen or so practical suggestions around the next, even more challenging phase of any white paper, which is the implementation phase. To get to this point can exhaust your intellectual capacity, but the work actually starts now and will be enduring as you seek to implement what's a very, very sound policy framework for your national security and national defence. The paper has a Malaysian character, which I think is very important. The way that you have grounded your strategic assessments in your history means it's real, and as the DNA of the findings of this document permeate throughout your systems, through your institutions, you will start to frame in your own way more clear-headed descriptions of the way that you view the world. But you have a very, very good starting point. As a general observation, from an Australian perspective, we would share the broad strategic assessments in this white paper around great power rivalry, focus on regional cooperation and non-traditional threats. So the intellectual framework that you have put in place resonates very, very strongly with the Australian strategic and defence policy community. I was very much drawn to your formulation of Malaysia as a maritime nation with continental roots. That's a very clever formulation. One only has to ponder for a few minutes the map of Malaysia in context. It's a maritime environment, but it has deep continental roots. And that, I think, is a very, very robust intellectual framework for you to start to educate the current and next generation of Malaysian security sector leaders to understand more the environment in which they need to think about the national security and defence of your country. So that's a very good start point. In Australia, we have this obsession with the term Indo-Pacific. We use that term to provide a frame of reference to the way that we view the world. The description of Malaysia as a bridging linchpin, again, that very much resonates from an Australian perspective. And when we look at the geographic context in which Australia contemplates its defence and security priorities, right in the centre of our locus is the archipelago. So whether you call it the fulcrum, the linchpin, I think that's a term that I probably will use as a term of convenience. It very much resonates with the way that we view the world. Critically important in your white paper, you have taken the very difficult step of trying to reconcile strategy, resources, with the kind of capability that the strategy says you need, and how much money have you got to pay for your future force. That framework of strategy, resources, capability, which underpins the white paper, that will stand you in very good stead as you go forward. And I'm also impressed, given the role that I played in the Australian white paper on the development of the future force and the development of the future budget, you have actually chanced your arm and you have set out in public priorities for the development of your future force. And that's really important once you enter into the next difficult phase of this process around the competition for resources and allocating priorities. I might just turn finally now to half a dozen or so I guess I call these suggestions on the implementation phase, which reflect the experience that we've had in Australia. We're now 4 years into the implementation of our last defence white paper, and there are many practical lessons that we have learned from that process. And the paper that we produced in 2016 was the 7th that we've done in our history since 1976. So although we have a lot of experience, it is a learning experience each time. And I was very pleased to hear the comment from a speaker earlier this morning about the appetite for Malaysia to make this a repeatable process. Because I think you have a framework to make this repeatable, but that is really important to keep this document dynamic and relevant. So my first observation, strategy will change far more rapidly than force structure or budgets can keep up with. The world is changing very rapidly. Decisions that you take in terms of your force structure planning now will be overtaken by events that challenge. The imperative is for you to remain flexible and adaptable in the way you cope with changes to the strategy. In Australia, we go through an annual process of reviewing the judgments in our white paper. This is an internal classified process that results in a discussion with government, but we don't make fundamental changes to the plan unless the strategic imperatives take us in that direction. And that'll be a challenge for you as we go forward. I would commend to you the notion of a continuous rolling process of review of the relevance and the contemporaneity of your white paper. Whether that's an annual process or a biennial process, I think you will find your own tempo and rhythm. Second, governments will change priorities due to strategic changes, technology changes, or political imperatives. That is the reality of the world that we live in as officials, and again, the onus is on us as officials to be flexible, adaptable, and responsive to governments when priorities change. But no plan survives first contact with the enemy. I think that's probably an axiom. Being willing to be flexible and not frustrated when plans are challenged is a very, very important quality. 3, and this is probably the most challenging aspect of the white paper from the Australian perspective, you will never have enough money to deliver all elements of the plan. And in our experience, as the naval shipbuilding element of our force structure plan has become more mature, the challenge on the budget from the maritime domain has grown. You will find that regardless of how much funding the government can allocate to defence capability, it won't be enough to meet all of your needs. The challenge then is how do you have a ruthless and disciplined process of prioritisation. And that's a process that has to be continual and has to be dynamic. So discipline is needed to keep the plan affordable and to keep the plan relevant. Fourth point, in our experience, one of the most successful initiatives that we somewhat painfully got to was we now have a genuine whole of government discussion in Australia around defence white paper. Defence traditionally in Australia is an insular organisation that speaks its own language and has not traditionally always played well in the whole of government space. The relationship with the Prime Minister's Department, with the Department of Finance has transformed in the last 4 years because we now have them inside the tent. They sit at the decision and deliberation table on every major defence decision going forward. So hardwiring your Prime Minister's Department, your Finance Department, Treasury into the way you think about the future force plan, I would commend as being very worthy of consideration. It's much more preferable in the Australian context, and I suspect in Malaysia, to have these other agencies as allies inside the tent rather than outside throwing stones at your plans. Fifth, we really benefited, in my view, from having a multidisciplinary team to oversee the implementation and further development of the white paper. So in some respects, the day you publish a white paper is day one of the new world. It's taken us 2 or 3 years to develop a mature framework, but having adult supervision of the development of your future force, senior civilian, senior military champions who can keep the program alive, very, very important. And in the Australian context, we have the discipline of being required to go to Cabinet every 6 months to give the Prime Minister an update on the implementation of the plan. A progress report is a very, very good discipline, and that report is taken forward to Cabinet by the Secretary of the Department of Defence and the Chief of Defence Force as a joint briefing product. It's a very, very good discipline. We've now done that 8 times in the last 4 years. It reminds government of the Defence White Paper. Governments have short attention spans. There are many competing priorities: education, health, welfare, energy policy. The opportunity to regularly present progress reports on white papers to Cabinet in itself is useful to remind governments of the importance of continuing to allocate funding to what is a very, very expensive part of government. Finally, last point, and I want to commend the framework that I saw in the Malaysian Defence White Paper. Governance of the way you take this forward is really, really important. The framework that you have proposed in terms of an internal governance mechanism, including an investment committee, I think you'll find that's an investment very, very well worth making, because again, it will keep the agency honest and put you in a position where you can have informed discussions with government about the way forward. So in conclusion, again, Deputy Minister Chin Tong, can I commend Malaysia for an excellent effort. You have a framework and you have a living document that will give guidance to policymakers. I would encourage anyone here, whether you're uniform or civilian, you need to internalise your white paper. It needs to become part of your DNA. It should guide the way you think about everything that you do. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to come to KL to speak to you today.
In this country, we borrowed quite heavily. We looked into what we did in Australia and also in many other countries, because we thought that we must not start from zero. So we started to look at how Australia did policies and also other countries, and we now come up with our own policy, what they got right. So our next speaker is the distinguished scholar from Vietnam, and I now ask an old friend of mine, Dr. Chai, please.
Thank you. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me to this prestigious forum. Let me, because I am the last speaker, and because of time limit, and I understand that this is the Chatham House forum, so I will be very frank, candid, and straightforward. Please allow me to go directly to the point. My presentation will have 3 sections. The first, I will make some comments on an assessment on the EWP, the very first one of Malaysia. Second one, I will share with you some of the key points in our own Vietnam's national defense paper issued last year. And the last point, I will talk about some ideas and recommendations for implementation. The first one, my sincere congratulations to Malaysia for having for the first time the EWP. This is a really important document, and we from outside, we can use that to understand a lot the logics, the understanding, as well as how Malaysia are thinking and implementing about defense sectors and security, not only of Malaysia but also with regard to the regions. I use 5 C's to describe the first DWP of Malaysia. Clear, comprehensive, cohesive and consistent, and constructive. These 5 C's, I think, is the best description of the very first one. And I think it's a little bit late, but late is better than never. So I should congratulations anyway. Second point, in order to make any comments and assessments, we have to come back to basic, to the purposes in issuing this DWP. Let me read the 3 purposes that you mentioned directly in the very first section of the DWP. That is engaging the public and the relevant stakeholders. Second is evaluating the ever-changing environment. And the third one is exploring the approaches to enhancing Malaysia's defense capacity. So I understood that with these 3 purposes, the DWP, the very first one, is very much domestic oriented. So there is a little bit discrepancies here. In the very first section, when you talk about challenges, most of the challenges mentioned in the very first section is external. But here, the purpose is very much domestic. So this is my first comment. The second comment, let me share when making our own Vietnam Defense White Paper, that our first purpose is to make it transparent or trust-building. With this in mind, I think Malaysia did a good job. At least it helped us to read some of the mindset behind the white paper, but it's still not enough. Second, everyone understands that behind transparency, there are some messages of difference. Sun Tzu, a very famous strategist of China, they said that achieving peace without war is the best, right? So every white paper, defense paper, included in that, implicitly, is the message of difference. Yes, there are some inside, but it's still a little bit confused, as my friend Dr. Tim already mentioned. In our case, we use the defense white paper as a textbook to be used in the training section of the whole political systems and in the military schools and academies. And I strongly recommend Malaysia to do the same. In order to achieve the consensus or agreement among the people and among every stakeholders, we should make it as simple as possible. To make it as a textbook, to teach, to train, process. I think that is the third purpose when we use the DWP. The next point I would like to share with you that with the funding, I am very frank with you that I found nothing there. Very generous. Let me share with you that when we make our Vietnam's defense white paper, we talk a lot about defense budget. And one of the key figures I seek is how much percentage of the GDP that one country should spend on the defense. For example, in the case of Vietnam in 2018, we spent 2.36% of our GDP in 2018 for defense purposes. If you can calculate that, our GDP last year or 2 years ago, 242 billion US dollars. So the rough figures is 6.5 billions. I think the current version of the DWP of Malaysia is short of that. If you provide some more, it is really good in transparency and trust building. The next point, in the second pillar, you talk about engaging the people. It's very good ideas, very nice. But I share with you some of our experience in Vietnam, the name of our people, of our armies, people.
Document. It is not intended to sort of discuss details of capabilities kind of thing. Yeah? Where I think anybody who has been working in the army, in the military, know that the white paper only provides the parameters for thinking or planning how on what you want to produce your capabilities on. And in another case, the white paper was intended mainly as an idea to engage everyone, the whole society, type of framework, and also, most importantly, and to tell the public that we need money in order to develop a strong military force. Now, if you look at this, a lot of questions being raised on the spending, the defense spending in Malaysia, and the missing part of the paper. Yes, it was done deliberately. It was done deliberately, and if you look at the defense expenditure of Malaysia over the past few years, it is one of the lowest in the region. If you compare it with our neighbor in Singapore, much lower. And at the moment, we spend less than 2% on the defense expenditure from Malaysia at 16 or 15.9 billion ringgit is less than 2% of the GDP of the country. So it was done with a purpose. Now, let me just go back to review what has been said in order to provide the basis for further discussion. Dr. Evans actually mentioned the need to reduce what we call it the strategic redundancies in order to promote cooperation, which I truly support. And he also mentioned that we need to increase the areas for shared interest, like training, institution building. That's a very important point, because I think we have not looked into it. And I think it's a duty and responsibility in the future, once we redo the next, or when we want to implement the white policy paper, we take that into consideration, how we can actually reduce the strategic, redundancies, and increase training between the countries. Already at the moment, we have some areas where we cooperate in training. For example, we send people to different sub-colleges kind of thing, but it's not. I think that this is more than that. Now, then we have a second speaker, Dr. Ashura, who spoke at length on the maritime domain of Malaysia. Very interesting point, because that has become a major concern in the white paper, and probably in future how it will affect the operational capabilities of the defense forces of Malaysia. Now, the maritime sector of Malaysia is large, relatively to the land mass. It's 1.8 times larger. So, and the geopolitics of it is also different, because we have territories which are separated by the sea. It's about, depending on how you measure it, no less than 1,000 kilometers between Kuala Lumpur and, say, for example, Kota Kinabalu and Sabah. So we have taken into account. And 40% of our GDP actually roughly comes from the sea. So we are quite conscious of the importance of the sea and how it's going to impact on our defense. But the sea is not by itself. The sea is also at the airspace above it. So we have also taken that into consideration. Then I think the areas that she suggests that we should work on is very commendable, on what we need to work together in order to achieve some kind of order at sea. It's very challenging to not only to Malaysia, but to Indonesia, to Vietnam, and I think my friend from Vietnam, as he mentioned, his willingness, of course, speaking on behalf of Vietnam, that he would work with in Malaysia in order to provide or to produce some kind of order at sea. Interestingly, with regard to Vietnam, just to give you some information before I open the discussion to the floor. In 2009, Malaysia and Vietnam submitted a joint proposal to the United Nations to on the what we call it, the extended continental shelf. Together, we did it together. Yeah. So that shows our sort of joint or willingness to work together on a very specific subject. And then earlier on, 2009, we actually also in 2009 we established a joint development area with Vietnam. Of course, yeah. Of course, with Indonesia, we had very long tradition of cooperation. We have what we call it we have an institution, a cooperative institution that look after the defense interests of those countries, right? And then we had Mr. Neil Ong, who actually told us, interestingly, the process of implementing the white paper, and I think the difficulties, the predicaments that Australia went through in order to come up with a goal, and to understand the dynamics surrounding the implementation of the white paper. It's not one-off. You've got to, and I think this is something which is relevant to policy matters. We've got to keep on asking the government to be on our side, keep informing them occasionally and regularly that defense is a very important aspect of the maintaining law and order in this country. Okay. Then the last speaker, actually, as I said, I did mention this now, was Dr. Chai, spoke on the some missing aspect, and then he said, very interestingly, it caught my eye. He said, it's a domestic. The white paper seemed to sort of focus on the domestic aspect of the security, and doesn't pay much attention to this to the external dimension. I think it's quite true, and that was the intention. That's what, and hence the reason why actually we actually have this kind of symposium, simply because we want to hear from our friends how we could sort of work together in order to establish a much more cooperative defense mechanism or framework for the region. Now, with that another summary of what has been discussed, I now open the floor for discussion. And as earlier on mentioned by Dr. Zakaria, former chairman, moderator, that we go by Chatham House rules, number one. And number two, if you want to speak, please identify yourself and please be brief. Because I think in the interest of managing the time, we now have I'm told that the minister will be coming here in 15 minutes, and I think we have half an hour for us to discuss issues. So may I invite the questions from the floor, please? Yeah, can I have a question from the floor, please? I saw a hand from my good friend.
Intent. I have a question and a comment for both Evan and Dr. Tran. Evan, and I want to extrapolate some of what you said. Evan, you mentioned the need to cooperate with neighbors, the need to have more mechanisms, and it's something that I really appreciate. And really, the level of cooperation is pretty extensive as it is. But in defense planning, defense spending, isn't this trust also hampered by the fact that we are sometimes most concerned about our neighbors? A lot of our plans are meant to deal with the possibility of problems arising from our immediate neighborhood. And you did allude to some of this, so I'm really curious as to how you see this moving forward, what are the major pitfalls along the way, and how we can overcome them. Dr. Tran, your point on ASEAN is really interesting, but it's something that I personally disagree. I agree, cooperation within the broader ASEAN framework is great, but the problem with ASEAN is that in a consensus decision-making organization, we only come to an agreement on the lowest common denominator, and I think that is not enough given the sort of issues that we are facing in this region. Perhaps the question for you, and again, also for Evan, if you want to take this, is that when you're speaking about cooperation, and I really believe that minilateral cooperation is the way forward here. But sometimes when you're dealing with major powers and issues in the South China Sea and this region, this unilateral cooperation will come at a cost. Are we willing to pay that cost? Are Southeast Asian countries willing to pay that cost? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Can I ask Evans, would you like to respond?
Thank you. Just a quick response on the first one, which is about threats from the neighbors or challenges from the neighbors. I do think that is the starting premise, which is threats travel closer, right? So I do think there's always going to be that problem, and not to mention the historical legacy between Indonesia and Malaysia. But I think that's precisely why I think we need more and not less engagement. And I think it is a bet, of course, between to what extent can familiarity and bond over time beats historical legacies. But I do think if I want to take that bet, I would rather invest in something that we can control. I think historical legacies are things we cannot control. Structural imbalance and all that we cannot control. But I do feel, for example, for Indonesia's plan to move the capital to Kalimantan, for example, I personally believe that I think it's an opportunity for Indonesia to explore much more deeper cooperation and engagement with Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines, and I don't think that's been taken on. And a part of that kind of not necessarily ignoring concerns of our neighbors, but I do think there's a lack of familiarity among our own officers with how our neighbors operate, think, and train, and look at the world. We are more familiar with how, for example, the Australians and the Americans operate, but we're not necessarily that close with our own neighbors. And I think that's where I believe more transparency and more engagement, and I think this white paper provides that avenue to think about much more deeper and much more expansive, both in terms of frequency as well as quality of engagement. On the unilateral side of things, I agree with you that there is a cost to be paid, but I do think if history has taught us anything, it's that relying on the great powers to come to our help has never been the best bet. So if we have to start thinking about being much more independent down the line, unilateral cooperation is something that we have in abundance in terms of bilateral engagement, but we rarely think of unilateral in terms of a framework of 3 or 4 or 5 countries. So I think there's a point in time right now, I believe, that we can leverage good bilateral relationships and strategic partnerships with Japan, with Australia, with South Korea, and others, and figure out a way beyond ASEAN, I think, to figure out how to engage much more of the regional powers, those stakeholders in the region, and start with practical steps rather than big 2+2 or big political stuff. So I think if we start from the bottom up in a more collaborative framework over concrete challenges, I think it's not necessarily easy, but I do think that's where the safest bet is, rather than relying on the great powers to come to our help. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Jai.
Thank you. Actually, I echo what Evan already mentioned. Let me emphasize the following 2 points. Point number 1 is that ASEAN is really important, ASEAN's mechanism, especially those with the participation of the uniform guys, more and more important in the coming years. The problem is that the defense sectors and the uniform guys participated in dealing with regional issues a little bit late if compared with the politicians and diplomats. But we need to devise and some more roles and engage them more in the process, especially among ASEAN and external partners. This is number 1. Number 2, that we need to open further, share more like this. This forum is very important. And it is more important if you can invite a Chinese defense specialist or someone from Japan in to share with them the ideas. I think that is really useful in making these regions more peaceful. The last point that yes, multilateral cooperation, I think, still already there, but not yet up to our expectation. It needs to be promoted more.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let me just expand on what Dr. Evans mentioned with regard to Malaysia-Indonesia relationship. We have established a very long relationship in defense cooperation between Indonesia and Malaysia. We established what we call it the General Border Committee, in fact, many years. And if I can go back slightly earlier, after the 1965 coup d'etat in Indonesia, by 1969, we signed a series of continental shelf treaties with Indonesia, and very difficult to do so in the past, but we were able because of the good relationship between the militaries to come up with 3 agreements in less than 2 years. It was remarkable. That is the kind of the relationship we established. But today, I think we have to strengthen the relationship because a few things happen. The domestic politics, what used to be in the past, the establishment of the relationship between the militaries, Indonesian military, Indonesia then was under military rule. And the militaries in Malaysia was very good. We had a very good relationship with the military officers. And I think that should continue. Now, with regard to ASEAN, very interesting the issue was raised. What kind of relationship we can establish, what kind of defense relationship. ASEAN was never designed to be a military organization. I think that is important. So within that context, we must understand what we can do together. Now, I think we have done quite well, despite some of the problems. Yeah. For example, we had somebody mentioned the ministers ADMM, the ASEAN Military Defense Ministers Council, the ADMM Plus, which include other non-ASEAN countries. That is a mechanism that we use in order to promote military cooperation. Number one. Number two, for example, apart from the official relationship, under the second or track 2 organization, for example, I'm involved in this NADI, which is the Network of ASEAN Defense Institute, comprising of 10 countries, where we sit down to discuss on how we could cooperate among ourselves, the defense institution, which I think is quite very useful in order to promote greater cooperation between the militaries. So these are some of the things which may, unfortunately, members of the public don't get to know what to do behind the scene. Okay, let me get another speaker before I turn on to Captain Martin. Yeah, can we get from this side? On my left here. Admiral, you have anything to say? Okay.
Since you call upon me. Well, you talk about ADMM, the ADMM laws and everything. Under the defense white paper, what is the difference between what we have done in the past and what we want to do more in once we come out with the defense white paper? Are we also going to be engaging with other organizations, like international organizations? Shura mentioned about UN organization and others. So are we going to do that? Is that part of the implementation plan that we have? Any of this?
Is that meant to be a commentary, or you are asking for some?
I think it will be different for what we have done in the past.
I should ask the Ministry of Defense people to respond to your question, but let me, being a former soldier in the armed forces myself, and I think also a member of the task force which helped with the development of the white paper. Now, the ADMM is a very useful mechanism in order for us to share, to air our views on the defense of the region. Now, ADMM Plus is another mechanism that involves external powers, ASEAN plus 8 other countries. Now, what we have been doing in the ADM, I think, are useful to the region. But it's not going to be much different in the future than what has been in the past. It is a process of a place where we sit down to discuss issues. Now, it's very important because issues are fluid in nature. They do not remain stagnant. And understanding the dynamics of the issues are important. This is where ADMM is important. But there is no value to it. We cannot put a value in terms of incentive on it. But the value is in the confidence building, with the ability to our capacity of all the ASEAN countries, together with their partners, to openly discuss the changing geostrategic issues that impact on the defense of each country and the region. That's all. So if you ask me, it's going to be much different in terms of process, not likely, but in terms of substance, yes. We are able to speak each other on the dynamics of the issues. And from there, we take on what we need, right? So this is in response, I hope, on behalf of Endeavour, although the Deputy Secretary General is here. Would you like to add something to it, Nazrin? Okay, thank you. Any other? Oh yeah.
Thanks for the question. I'd like to actually first address your first question, where you asked how much different would we be with the release of the new, would Malaysia be with the release of the new defense white paper. And if anything, I think one particular concept that remains under note is the defense white paper's willingness to want to adopt a whole of society and whole of government approach, something which is actually quite unique as a defense white paper. But yet to actually put this concept forward is a task in itself, especially trying to implement it. But nevertheless, I think the defense white paper is a good step in this direction, seeing that it is publicly available. And I hear that there will be a lot of engagement with the public in order to try to get the messaging of the defense white paper forward. And this helps a lot in what Aaron mentioned with reducing strategic redundancy, for example, by pulling in more stakeholders in society to play a larger role in defending Malaysia's security interests, especially from a maritime security perspective. I do feel the community can play a larger role in this. In terms of including enhancing defense engagement with more international organizations, I feel that there is a lot of need for this, and this is something we should all definitely look towards doing. The European Union, for example, will be able to extend more assistance, and they are interested in playing a larger role in our region. Having said that, I think that also Malaysia is looking to play a larger linchpin role in trying to connect two regions with one another. I think that is something that should be explored in greater detail. For example, India's Navy has a new IFC center in New Delhi. Is there any way that Malaysia's MINDEF would have a stronger role in engaging with IFC over there? And I think Malaysia should exploit this opportunity in bridging these two different regions to one another. Having said that, I think that most of our focus should be internal within the region, and I do agree that unilateral engagements are the step forward. With the TCA, it has received quite a lot of criticism for not being effective enough, but we need to remember that the TCA was only set up 2 years ago, and for it to achieve so much in such little time is actually tremendous progress for us all as a region. If we can emulate these initiatives in other parts of Southeast Asia, we will be strengthening our resilience as a region. And I feel we may no longer be asking what other organizations can we work towards with. Thanks very much.
Can I give the floor to Captain Martin, who has been waiting patiently?
Thank you, sir. Captain Martin from Maritime Ministry of Malaysia. Today we talk about Malaysia's inaugural defense white paper, ideas and implementation. So one of the ideas that MIMA did in the east of Sabah is this Kasban at Sea project. We've already published this. As you can see, our S zone is blue in color, not red in color, because we see that as a blue economy zone and not combat zone. So today, Dr. Ashura also mentioned about engaging the society and having a one-stop center for defense and security to come and share. We have had this experience as what Dr. Tran mentioned, peace. Malaysia is not just about peacekeeping, also about peace efforts for the facilitators in Mindanao. So 4 years from now, Jakarta will be moving to Kalimantan, and Mindanao is already seeing the peace process. As of January, 4,000 fighters have already, from MILF, have already been reintegrated. By 2022, another 40,000. So in 4 years' time, we will see new development in Mindanao. We will see Jakarta moving to Borneo, and then we will see that the Sulu Sea will become the next stretch of Malacca. Defense white paper. Are we prepared for this? More about community engagement. So MIMA has come out with recommendations. So from here, it's about time we also MINDEF, an opportunity for MINDEF to engage the think tanks and work with them on the existing research that has already been done, more of community development, and looking at moving on to the Pacific from the east of Sabah. Our next stop, San Diego, San Salvador, and Santiago. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, thank you. It was a very good advertisement for MIMA. I think it's a very interesting point that he has made because of the situation they see. And I honestly think that in future, we are likely to face more problems at sea than on land. And the sea is a very common sort of domain, because there's so much overlaps at sea in terms of boundaries, also in terms of function. Now, what is interesting is actually when we talk about the sea, and I haven't really quite doing some work on sea. I think the situation at sea, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of US Sino-Pacific, I think is going to be quite difficult to manage in the very near future. The problem at sea in the South China Sea, for example, is another issue that I think for us, we have to take that into interest. Not only us, but say, for example, Indonesia. So although Indonesia doesn't claim any territory in the South China Sea, but its offshore area of Natuna, for example, has invited a lot of problems. And most recently, I think Dr. Evan could tell you how President Jokowi sent the military or the Navy into the area in order to prevent the Chinese Navy from, Coast Guard rather, from interfering further in the area. And we also see Vietnam taking a much more aggressive stand against Chinese interference in the South China Sea. There is an area that I think that's not only affect the defense of Malaysia, but it's an also area which has to do with foreign policy. Here is the problem. The interface between foreign policy and defense policy. Who is going to do what? Which is the area that comes under foreign policy and which area that comes strictly under defense. Now this is something that's a predicament that policy planners have to worry. But this is basically, to me, is a domestic issue. How MINDEF and foreign policy, or in our case called the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, could work together. It calls for type of coordination. It is said that done. This is the management problem. But I think the future in this country, as I see it, we are looking into the sea in a much more serious way. And I've always argued that the sea needs a new ministry. Indonesia has got a ministry that looks after the sea. South Korea, Japan, Canada, and many other countries. And I think it's a question of coordination. So probably through this white paper, hopefully when it comes to the implementation part of it, will address the issue of the lacuna in the sea, in the hope that we have a better, what do you call this, order or I see. All right, can I, yeah, gentleman at the back there. Oh. I thought you raised your hand, no? All right, any other soalan, any other question?